Hi, I'm Abra Anderson. I'm going to be discussing an article today by Bearse de Jong from 2008. In this article, they report a study that they did in some secondary schools on their two-way immersion programs. The article is titled Cultural and Linguistic Investment, Adolescents in a Secondary Two-Way Immersion Program. I'm going to be referring to it as a DLI program. I picked this article and this topic because I'm a secondary teacher and have a high interest in adolescents and especially DLI secondary programs. So, the rationale that the authors had for this study were threefold. First, they noted that in 2008, the highest growth rates in ELLs was at the high school level, although most DLI programs are the elementary level, so there's a need. Second, the studies on the programs above elementary grades are scarce. There were not very many of them. And third, the data from those studies suggests mixed long-term results. So, what were the mixed long-term results? On the negative side, there are four things. First, they noted an increase in English proficiency, but a decline in Spanish reading in the secondary grades. Also, they noted the motivation and the opportunity to use Spanish diminished as the years went on, and students' identity and language investment shifted to English, not surprising, and students resisted using Spanish in the secondary, which is also not surprising. On the positive side, the participants had very positive attitudes toward DLI programs in general. And participants reported that the program played an important role in their staying in school. I think this is very interesting to me because currently in the United States, the dropout rates for Latino students is very high. And third, DLI students took more advanced math classes, which is an indication of their academic success. So the study by Bearse de Jong, the question that they were asking was they wanted to know the perception of the secondary students in the DLI programs. So they give us a definition of what secondary DLI was in these programs that they study. This is very different than how we run our DLI in Utah, but the programs that de Jong and Bearse studied were such that the population was 50% Anglo, 50% Latino, about half and half. The program from 6th to 8th grade consisted of two classes at a time. You take social studies and language arts, and the rest was in English. In 9th through 11th grade, they took just one class throughout the year, and it was a Spanish language and literature class. And then in 12th grade, all the students just took the one AP prep class so they could take the exam. So this study that de Jong and Bearse did consisted of two different things. They had 166 individual student surveys that were taken. And as it turned out, just about 50-50 Latino students and Anglo students that took those surveys. And then they had 24 focus groups, and each focus group had 3 or 4 students in it. The interesting thing about the focus groups was they divided them by native language. So they had Latino focus groups, 3 or 4 students, and Anglo focus groups of 3 or 4 students. The individual student surveys covered the following pretty much 4 questions. First, what language do you speak most at home and what language do you speak most with friends? Second, which language do you speak the best? Which do you read the best? Which do you write the best? And which do you like the best? Next, they asked about their DLI teachers, what their opinions were of the DLI teachers. And finally, their attitudes towards school in general and bilingualism in general. The focus groups went in a completely different direction. Well, not completely different, but very different direction. They were asked to describe their experiences in DLI in elementary and then in junior high or middle. And if they were old enough, they were asked to describe the experience in high school. They were asked what made each year difficult or easy. They were asked what their teachers could specifically have done differently to help them learn better. And they were asked if they considered themselves bilingual and if they considered themselves bicultural. So 4 dominant themes emerged from the data that they received from all these surveys and study groups. First was the attitude that the students had toward the program. The second theme was the attitudes toward bilingualism. Third was this whole concept of multiculturalism. And fourth, the program identity and equity, or in other words, as I understood it, what is the program to you? How do you feel the program is in the secondary? And is it equally serving the Hispanic students and the Anglo students? So I just went ahead and put the table right here that had the answers for student attitude. Interestingly, very, very high percentage of the students strongly agreed positively um, with these statements. The one that was highest was I like learning Spanish and English. So it's very positive, and this was borne out in the previous studies that were done with secondary students. They very much like the program. They like learning the two languages. All of them ranked very high. Next, student attitudes toward bilingualism. Two interesting things came from this. First off, the one that received the highest ranking was I can get a good job knowing two languages. So the students were thinking future earning potential, they were thinking future employment. The other interesting one, I think, and the authors noted this as well, is knowing two languages will help you get good grades. Received the lowest, but still so far, into the positive range, but lower than the others was that I would get good grades. The Hispanos, the Latinos, ranked a little higher by 4 percentage points. I don't know if that's significant or not. However, interestingly, other studies that we have seen in this class that we've read and studied show that the Latinos who are in a DLI program get much better grades, significantly better grades, throughout the years, going up through the years into high school, than their counterparts that aren't in DLI. So, interesting. Also, along the lines of the attitudes toward bilingualism, something interesting, but not super surprising, was this difference between the perception of the Anglo students and the Latino students. The Anglos stressed that bilingualism was great for college prep and job opportunities in the future. So, all about the future and what they'd be able to do with it. The Latinos stressed staying true to their roots, not losing their identity, and their connection to family. It was mentioned more than once. I can speak with my abuela and things like that. So interesting. The third theme, biculturalism. The Anglos, of course, did not identify as bicultural. They said they did like making friends from other cultures. They had felt they were more open to other cultures because of their experience in DLI, but they realized they need to live in a community to be bicultural. The Latinos, of course, recognize themselves as bicultural. Interestingly, most of them identified as Hispanic or Latino. Next biggest group identified as Hispanic American or Latino Americano, something like that. But they pretty much across the board rejected just being American. They also said that they felt that they had two different identities: an at-home identity and at-school identity, which also is not at all surprising. At home, they felt Latino. At school, they feel American, which I think is a positive thing. I felt in reading the article that the authors tended to think it was more of a negative thing and felt like it's something that could be addressed or helped or changed in some way, which I kind of lost me there. Okay, the last was program identity and equity. So how they feel about the program and whether or not it's in an equitable way serving the Latino and the Anglo students. So both of the groups, Latinos and Anglos, felt that it was sad that they were speaking less Spanish, exposed to less Spanish in the secondary part of the DLI program. The Anglos felt that they weren't getting enough time and that their Spanish wasn't really progressing. Some said they felt like they were plateauing. The Hispanic students also felt that they were not getting as much time in Spanish as they would like. They approached it a little differently. I thought this was interesting in the groups. The Anglo students suggested extracurricular things, groups, maybe clubs where they could get together and talk and be exposed to Spanish. They were in favor of field trips, foreign field trips, which is always a great idea. The Hispanic groups in their discussion, they kind of thought maybe more classes in Spanish would be a good thing. Both groups questioned whether or not it still could be considered a DLI program as it got further and further up the ladder, closer to the end of high school, where there was just one class a day. They felt like it didn't feel like a DLI program anymore. Okay, so the findings. The authors came away with what they considered their three findings. The first was that the two groups of students, the Hispanic and the Anglos, had distinctly different agendas in their involvement in the program. What they were hoping to get out of it was different. And so the authors felt that if we didn't pay attention to that as educators and shareholders, if we didn't consider that in developing these programs, that we might be failing to make them relevant, failing to meet the needs of the students. The second was the idea of a linguistic hierarchy that occurs as the kids move through the program, whereas in elementary, they're half day Spanish, half day English. By the time they're in high school, most of the students are doing most everything in English. They felt like this idea of English being higher up in the hierarchy of languages at the school and in the community undermined the program's intent to equalize language and equalize student status. They lost me on this one because though I did understand their arguments and they had interesting points, I don't think personally that the program's intent is to equalize languages and equalize student status. It's worth arguing, but I felt that they were maybe going beyond the scope of what DLI is supposed to do. Anywhere you go, there's going to be a hierarchy of language according to whatever's the most spoken and used in that area. Anyway, the third finding is the diminishing role of Spanish creating an unequal learning opportunity for the Latino students. So it becoming skewed the higher up you go. Their thinking was that the Anglo students were benefiting more from the program in the secondary. I was not convinced, but would need to do more study. I found it interesting, but I was not convinced that the Anglo students were getting more benefit from the program as it went on. The second thing they thought, that the second point they made was that the Latino students were losing their Spanish skills because they were surrounded by English. And the third was they were quite concerned again with this idea that the students have two lives or two parts to their life, where they're Latino at home and Anglo at school. Once again, just to reiterate, my feeling was, why would we want to change that? If I were to move, say, to South America, where I have lived in South America before, I would have lived in South America and I had my little America at home. And then out in public, I was more Bolivian than anything. That is a natural consequence, and I don't think a bad thing. Okay, the conclusion that the authors had was that that educators and other shareholders need to engage in some critical analysis on what these program outcomes really are, how they're being distributed between the Anglo students and the Latino students. And by outcomes, they're talking about linguistically, academically, and socioculturally. Again, I would say I felt they leaned heavily toward the sociocultural. I tend to think that the linguistic and academic is more what we are striving to achieve in the DLI programs. But very interesting, and I would love to discuss it and study more about it. Thank you for listening.